Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at working with our 4D and 5D compensation tables found within our Link G5 and G4X programming. Now, these compensation tables allow us to offset fuel and spark timing from our main fuel table or the main spark timing table. These compensation tables allow us a lot of custom flexibility in how we want to implement a compensation. So we're going to go through a couple different variables, different conditions where we may want to implement a 4D or 5D compensation table. We're going to go through some of the basic details here for programming and talk about how to turn them on. Now, we will be touching on 4 and 5D tables all throughout the training course and going into the live training tutorials because I use them quite frequently for a variety of different things for compensation. Now, the idea of a compensation table should make sense at this point in the training course. We have compensation tables in play for things like fuel and spark timing already. They're programmed or pre-programmed from Link within the firmware logic. So if we go here from our fuel, we've talked about if we go over our fuel trim, we have compensation tables for things like our post-start fuel or warm-up enrichment fuel or even IAT fuel trim table. If you have your IAT fuel correction turned on, we typically use this with the traditional mode. These tables are going to be either adding or subtracting a certain amount of fuel to whatever the base pulse width is that we typically would send through the main fuel table, through the air and fuel modeling. We figure out a pulse width, we send that to the injector. Before that is sent to the injector, the correction is applied to it and we have an offset. So we're either adding or subtracting fuel in specific conditions. So these tables are things that are always needed for any engine. So that's why they're populated here in the firmware and we can access them and program them. Other things, such as having a compensation table, for example, for compensation for load. So as sometimes some engines, when they have variable valve timing, they need a further compensation table because the volumetric efficiency table sometimes isn't able to characterize how much airflow we need to model in order to properly get things dialed in for the engine. So I'll talk about an example here. One of the first examples we take a look at. This is going to be for a Subaru EJ25 engine with a big turbo, big cams, and it has the variable valve timing. And we'll see that I've used the fuel compensation table to offset the main fuel table so that those volumetric efficiency values weren't sky high because I could not get the fueling right. And that's just simply because the airflow model wasn't also accounting for the variable valve timing. So sometimes we need to do this. I find this on Evo 9s and sometimes then on Subaru engines, variable valve timing engines, I have to implement this. So we'll talk about that particular example. We'll find that we may also have some other things that require fueling offset. So if we have a cooling fan turning on, we might have to add a little bit of fuel. You might find that it leans out with a load on the engine. You'll also find that you can use the fueling compensation to create a burble effect. We can also have a spark timing offset to create a burble effect on overrun conditions where we have the popping and banging on decel. You can also use the compensation tables to compensate for ethanol, for spark timing and fuel. So if you're in traditional mode, as you're trying to dial in the flex fuel based tune, you have no real good way to do it. So we'd use the 4 and 5D compensation tables to compensate for fuel and spark timing as we're varying our ethanol content. So we're going to look at a couple different examples here and understand how this is implemented. But the idea of being able to turn on additional compensation tables should make sense. So these are things that Link is not going to have set up in the software already. It's going to be left up to us and our creativity of what we need to set up and configure to make a fuel offset happen or a spark timing offset. We're talking about spark timing here. If we flip over to our spark window, we're going to find in our spark window, we have an engine coolant temp compensation. We've talked about this in our compensation trim tables. This is going to be offsetting fuel or spark timing against their main spark timing table. Cold engine, we have a high frictional loss on the engine that creates torque loss. As a result, we have to compensate. We usually add a little bit of spark advance on a cold engine. And then as the engine's warm, we typically pull spark timing out so we don't have a knock or pre-ignition a situation occurring where the engine could be potentially damaged. So we use something like an engine coolant temp ignition trim table here to be able to offset the fuel or spark timing coming from our main spark timing table. That same idea can be used for a 4-5D spark compensation table for some specific condition. So these air temp compensation, engine coolant temp compensation, these compensation tables are something that Link provides the ability to turn on or off in the software here to have the compensation in play. They're more a standardized compensation. So the 4 and 5D represent kind of a unique way to provide the same kind of offset in unique situations or conditions that we may find ourselves in. All right, so let's move here from our Spark page and let's go over here to our 4 and 5D page. This is where we find our 4D fuel, 4D spark, 5D fuel, and 5D spark. Now we can actually turn one or the other on. So for example, I don't have to turn on a 4D compensation before I turn on a 5D. I could actually just turn one on or the other on or both on at the same time. We can use 4D offset for fuel and we can use 5D offset for ignition. So you're not locked into having to enable the 4D before you enable the 5D, and you can enable fuel and spark timing independently of each other, meaning you don't have to apply an ignition correction for 4D and also apply a fuel correction. So you can use one or the other. You can mix and match however you want to do this. There's a lot of flexibility here. Let's talk about just setting up a 4D fuel compensation here so we can see what a load compensation would look like. If we go down towards the bottom here of our window, we have 4D ignition table. We can turn the ignition mode on. This is going to turn on the compensation table. We have our 4D fuel table. This is actually what we want to take a look at here. So in this example, we'll go here to our 4D fuel mode and we're going to go to on, and it's going to populate in our window some other variables here. We can see table activation. This is going to be how we want this table to turn on. Now the table can be based on a 2D value or a 3D value. So we can have two axes here to make a 3D table, or we can have a single axis to create a 2D table. Depends on how you want to apply this and what you're actually doing here. Typically we want a 3-dimensional table, and we typically want on the table activation set to always on.
Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here, and you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.